Hey, tonight we are going to explore the ancient rhythms of hope and patience that governed the lives of medieval farmers as they waited for rain. Picture weathered hands pressed against wooden window frames, eyes scanning cloudless skies for any hint of moisture. Imagine the weight of entire communities resting on the whims of weather, where a single drop could mean the difference between abundance and famine. In this gentle journey, we will walk alongside these forgotten souls who understood the sacred art of waiting, who measured time not in hours but in the slow turn of seasons, who found profound meaning in the simple act of watching the heavens and trusting in forces far greater than themselves. If you find comfort in these quiet moments together, I would be so grateful if you could take a moment to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us continue creating these peaceful escapes from the busy world. Speaking of which, where are you listening from tonight? Are you tucked beneath warm blankets, or perhaps sitting by a window watching your own piece of sky? Now dim your lights. Settle into the softest corner of your space and let the gentle rhythm of centuries past carry you into the world of those who knew that waiting itself could be a form of prayer. The morning of the 13th day dawned with the same relentless clarity that had marked every sunrise since the rains had ceased. Brother Thomas pressed his weathered palm against the cool stone of the monastery window, feeling the familiar ache in his joints that spoke of approaching autumn and the persistent absence of moisture in the air. Below him, the abbey's fields stretched like a vast parchment scroll. The earth cracked into intricate patterns that resembled the illuminated manuscripts he spent his days copying in the scriptorium. In the village beyond the monastery walls, Aldrich the farmer rose before dawn as his father had taught him, and his father's father before that. His calloused hands moved through the morning rituals with the practiced grace of generations, checking the thin stream that trickled from the well, examining the brittle stalks of barley that stood like sentinels in his field, running his fingers through soil that had once been rich and dark, but now felt like fine sand between his weathered digits. The drought had settled over the countryside like an unwelcome guest who had long overstayed their welcome. 7 weeks had passed since the last substantial rainfall, and the memory of that blessed day seemed as distant as the stories of saints that the priests shared during Sunday Mass. Children who had been born that spring had never felt rain upon their faces, and their mothers would hold them up to the endless blue sky, whispering prayers and pointing to clouds that drifted by like sailing ships, carrying precious cargo to distant lands. In the great hall of Lord Edmund's manor, the nobleman stood before a window that faced west toward the fields his family had held for 3 generations. His steward, a thin man named Geoffrey, who kept meticulous records of every grain harvested and every penny spent, approached with the morning reports clutched in his ink-stained fingers. The numbers painted a picture that both men understood without words. The stores of grain were dwindling faster than anticipated. The mill wheel turned slower each day as the river dropped, and the animals grew restless as the grass yellowed and withered beneath the relentless sun. Yet in this landscape of anxiety and uncertainty, there existed a rhythm of life that had persisted for countless centuries. The waiting was not passive, but filled with the quiet activities that sustained both body and spirit. Aldrich's wife, Margaret, had learned from her mother the ancient art of preserving what remained. Her hands worked steadily through the morning hours, grinding the last good grain into flour, carefully rationing the precious salt that would keep their meager stores of meat from spoiling, and teaching her young daughter Eleanor the songs that women had sung while working since time immemorial. The child's voice rose sweet and clear in the small cottage, weaving through the verses that spoke of seasons turning and rains returning, of patient earth and faithful sky. Eleanor's grandmother had taught Margaret these same songs decades earlier, during another drought that had tested the village's resolve. The melodies carried within them the accumulated wisdom of generations who had learned that survival depended not only on the work of hands, but on the cultivation of hope. Brother Thomas had taken to spending his afternoons in the monastery garden, where the monks had redirected their precious well water to keep alive the herbs and vegetables that would sustain them through the coming winter. The garden was a testament to the careful stewardship that monastic life demanded. Each plant was positioned to take advantage of every drop of moisture, every shadow, every breath of wind that might carry the scent of distant rain. The old monk moved slowly between the rows, his sandaled feet silent on the hard-packed earth. His hands, though gnarled with age, moved with surprising gentleness as he tended each plant. The sage released its aromatic oils beneath his touch. The thyme spread its silver-green leaves to catch the morning dew, and the carefully cultivated rows of onions and leeks stood like miniature armies marshaled against the forces of drought and despair. As the sun climbed higher, painting the stone walls of the monastery with warm golden light, Brother Thomas would often pause in his work to observe the sky. This daily ritual had become a form of meditation, a practice of attention that connected him to the natural world in ways that his years of scholarly study never could. He watched the formation and dissolution of clouds, noted the subtle shifts in wind direction, and felt in his bones the atmospheric pressure that spoke of weather systems moving across the vast expanse of countryside. In the village, other forms of watching took place. The miller, whose livelihood depended entirely upon the flow of water through his wheel, had developed an almost supernatural sensitivity to the sounds of his stream. Each morning, he would walk the length of the mill race, listening to the gradually diminishing voice of the water as it trickled over stones worn smooth by centuries of flow. His trained ear could detect changes in volume and velocity that would escape the notice of others, and these subtle variations became the foundation of a complex calculus of hope and concern. The blacksmith, whose forge required water for tempering, steel and whose animals needed drink, had begun to time his work according to the availability of moisture. The rhythmic hammer blows that had once rung out from dawn to dusk now fell silent during the hottest hours of the day, resuming only when the evening brought the possibility of dew formation. His apprentice, a boy named William, whose quick hands and eager spirit made him invaluable despite his youth, had learned to read the subtle signs that indicated when the fire should be banked and when the precious water should be conserved. The women of the village had developed their own network of information and support. They gathered each morning at the well, where the slowly dropping water level provided a daily measure of their collective situation. But these gatherings were about more than the practical matter of securing water for their households. They became forums for the sharing of knowledge, the distribution of resources, and the maintenance of the social bonds that would prove essential if the drought continued. Dame Isabel, the Lord's wife, often joined these informal assemblies, despite the social protocols that might have kept her apart from the village women. Her presence spoke to the recognition that drought was a force that transcended the usual boundaries of class and station. When the rains failed, all were united in their dependence upon forces beyond human control. Her contributions to these discussions were valued not only for her access to information from the manor house, but for her practical knowledge of household management acquired through years of overseeing the complex operations of the estate. Though children of the village had adapted to the new reality with the remarkable flexibility that youth provides. They created games that incorporated the themes of waiting and hoping, developed elaborate rituals designed to encourage the return of rain, and found ways to transform anxiety into adventure. Young Eleanor and her companions would spend hours arranging small stones into patterns that supposedly resembled clouds, creating miniature landscapes where they could enact stories of drought and abundance. These children's games often took place in the shade of the great oak tree that stood at the center of the village green. This ancient giant, whose roots reached deep into the earth and whose branches provided shelter for countless generations, had become a symbol of endurance and patience. The villagers told stories of how the tree had survived droughts far worse than the current one, how its deep roots found moisture even when the surface soil turned to dust, and how its presence promised that this too would pass. The priest, Father Benedict, had incorporated special prayers for rain into the daily rhythm of worship. These supplications were not desperate pleadings, but carefully crafted acknowledgments of human dependence upon divine providence. The congregation would gather in the small stone church, their voices joining in ancient Latin phrases that had been spoken during countless other times of trial. The ritual of prayer provided not only spiritual comfort, but also a framework for understanding their situation within the larger context of faith and tradition. The church itself seemed to embody the patience that the situation required. Its thick stone walls, built to last for centuries, spoke of the long perspective that sustained communities through difficult times. The colored light that filtered through its simple windows created patterns that shifted throughout the day, reminding the faithful that even in times of apparent stillness, there was constant movement and change. The building stood as evidence that human effort, guided by faith and sustained by community, could create structures that endured far beyond the lifespan of any individual. Lord Edmund had begun to correspond with his neighbours in the surrounding counties, seeking information about conditions elsewhere and exploring possibilities for mutual aid if the situation worsened. These letters, carefully composed by the manor's clerk and carried by riders whose horses had to be carefully rationed water for their journeys, created a network of communication that extended far beyond the immediate locality. The responses that arrived painted a picture of widespread concern, but also of communities working together to address shared challenges. The riders who carried these messages became unofficial bearers of news and encouragement. Their reports of rain falling in distant valleys provided hope that the drought was not universal, while their accounts of successful conservation efforts in other communities offered practical strategies that could be adapted to local conditions. These exchanges of information created a sense of connection that helped counter the isolation that geographical distance and difficult travel conditions might otherwise have imposed. As the days shortened and the sun's angle became more oblique, the quality of waiting began to change. The urgent anxiety of the early weeks had given way to a more patient endurance, a recognition that this trial would require not just immediate adaptation, but long-term commitment to survival strategies. The farmers began to plan their autumn activities around the assumption that significant rain might not come before winter, while the craftsmen adapted their work to accommodate reduced water availability. Margaret had begun teaching Eleanor not only the songs of her ancestors, but also the stories that accompanied them. These narratives, passed down through generations of women, contained practical knowledge disguised as entertainment. They spoke of plants that could survive drought, of methods for finding underground water, and of social practices that help communities endure extended periods of hardship. The telling of these stories in the evening hours created a sense of continuity that connected the present generation to the wisdom of the past. The monastery's scriptorium had taken on a new significance during these weeks of waiting. Brother Thomas and his fellow scribes continued their work of copying manuscripts, but they had begun to pay particular attention to texts that dealt with agricultural practices, weather lore, and spiritual responses to natural disasters. These documents, preserved through the careful work of countless generations of monks, contained accumulated knowledge that proved remarkably relevant to their current situation. The illuminated letters that decorated these manuscripts seemed to glow with special intensity in the clear, dry air. The gold leaf caught the abundant sunlight and reflected it back in ways that created moments of unexpected beauty. Brother Thomas found himself thinking that perhaps this abundance of light was compensation for the absence of rain. a reminder that even in times of scarcity, there could be forms of richness that sustain the spirit, if not the body. The harvest season arrived with its usual urgency, despite the reduced yields that the drought had guaranteed. The grain that had survived was carefully gathered, every stalk examined and preserved. The threshing was done with unusual care, as no grain could be wasted. The winnowing process, normally a communal activity marked by songs and stories, became a nearly reverent ritual as the precious wheat was separated from the chaff under the watchful eyes of entire families. Dame Isabel organized the women of the manor in preparing for winter with the assumption that supplies would be limited. The great hall was transformed into a workshop where every scrap of fabric was turned into useful items, where every bone was boiled for soup, and where every root and herb was carefully preserved. The work was accompanied by stories and songs that made the labor feel less burdensome, while also transmitting knowledge about survival techniques that might prove essential in the months ahead. The children had learned to find entertainment in activities that required no resources beyond imagination and companionship. They created elaborate games of pretense that allowed them to practice adult roles while also providing escape from the underlying anxiety that affected the entire community. Eleanor became particularly skilled at organizing these activities, demonstrating leadership qualities that impressed the adults who observed her quick thinking and natural empathy. Brother Thomas had begun to notice subtle changes in the natural world that suggested the seasons were progressing despite the apparent stasis of the drought. Certain birds had begun their southward migration, following ancient routes that connected his small corner of the world to vast networks of movement and change. The angle of sunlight had shifted enough to create new patterns of shadow and illumination in the monastery garden, while the night air carried scents and sounds that spoke of autumn's gradual approach. These observations became the foundation for a different kind of hope, one based not on the expectation of immediate relief, but on the recognition that natural cycles continue their ancient rhythms even during periods of apparent disruption. The monk found comfort in the knowledge that autumn rains, when they came, would be part of seasonal patterns that had repeated for countless centuries and would continue long after his own life had ended. The village well had dropped to levels that required careful rationing, but it had not run dry. This fact became a source of community pride and a symbol of the wisdom of their ancestors who had chosen this location and dug deep enough to reach water that could sustain them through difficult times. The daily gathering at the well took on ceremonial aspects, with each family taking only what was needed and expressing gratitude for what remained. Father Benedict had begun to speak in his sermons about patience as a form of faith, about waiting as a spiritual discipline that could transform suffering into wisdom. His words resonated with a congregation that was living the reality of extended uncertainty. The priest drew upon biblical stories of drought and abundance, of wandering and arrival, creating connections between their immediate experience and the larger patterns of spiritual life that transcended individual circumstances. The miller had discovered that his reduced water flow could still power his wheel if he made adjustments to accommodate the changed conditions. This adaptation required both technical skill and philosophical acceptance of new limitations. The steady rhythm of the wheel, though slower than before, continued to provide the community with ground grain, while also serving as an audible reminder that life and work could continue even under challenging circumstances. Lord Edmund had begun to implement conservation measures throughout his estate that would have long-term benefits regardless of when the rains returned. These included the construction of cisterns for collecting whatever precipitation might fall, the creation of windbreaks to reduce evaporation, and the establishment of new policies for managing shared resources. These projects provided employment for workers while also preparing the community for greater resilience in the future. As the weeks passed, the waiting had acquired its own rhythm and meaning. What had begun as anxious anticipation had evolved into a form of patient endurance that drew strength from community bonds and spiritual practices. The villagers had learned to find satisfaction in small improvements, to celebrate minor successes, and to maintain hope without depending upon immediate gratification. They had discovered that waiting itself could be a source of meaning when it was shared with others and connected to larger purposes. Margaret had begun to teach Eleanor the subtle arts of household management that would serve her throughout her life. These lessons encompassed not only practical skills, but also the attitudes and approaches that would enable her to thrive regardless of external circumstances. The child learned to take pride in making do with less, to find creative solutions to resource limitations, and to understand her role within the larger community of mutual support and shared responsibility. The monastery garden had become a place of pilgrimage for villagers seeking both practical advice and spiritual comfort. Brother Thomas welcomed these visitors, sharing his knowledge of plants and weather, while also offering the wisdom that came from years of contemplative life. These conversations created connections between the religious and secular communities that strengthened both, while demonstrating that survival required not only practical measures, but also attention to the needs of the spirit. The oak tree at the center of the village had become a gathering place for evening conversations that helped the community process their shared experience. These informal sessions served multiple purposes. They allowed for the exchange of information and resources, provided emotional support for those struggling with anxiety, and created opportunities for collaborative problem solving. The tree's ancient presence reminded participants that they were part of a story much larger than their immediate circumstances. Young William, the blacksmith's apprentice, had begun to develop skills that would serve him well regardless of his chosen profession. The discipline required to work with limited resources, the patience needed to wait for optimal conditions, and the creativity necessary to find alternative solutions were all qualities that the drought had demanded and that would prove valuable throughout his life. His master took pride in seeing the boy develop not only technical competence, but also the character traits that would make him a valuable member of any community. The correspondence network that Lord Edmund had established with neighbouring estates had evolved into a system of mutual support that transcended the immediate crisis. Communities shared resources, exchanged information, and coordinated responses to common challenges. These relationships, forged in adversity, would continue to provide benefits long after the drought had ended, creating a regional network of cooperation and mutual aid. Dame Isabel had discovered leadership abilities that she had not known she possessed. The crisis had created opportunities for her to take initiative, organize resources, and provide guidance to others. Her success in these roles challenged traditional assumptions about women's capabilities, while also demonstrating the benefits of drawing upon all available talents during difficult times. Her example inspired other women to take more active roles in community problem solving. The children's games had evolved to incorporate increasingly sophisticated understandings of weather, agriculture, and community cooperation. Eleanor and her friends created elaborate scenarios that allowed them to practice the skills and attitudes they observed in the adults around them. These play activities served as both entertainment and education, preparing the next generation for the responsibilities they would one day assume, while also providing current stress relief through imaginative engagement. Brother Thomas had begun to understand his scholarly work in new ways. The manuscripts he copied contained not only religious teachings, but also practical knowledge that could serve immediate needs. His careful preservation of these texts took on added significance as he recognized their potential value for future generations facing similar challenges. The scriptorium became a repository not only of spiritual wisdom, but also of accumulated human knowledge about survival and adaptation. The waiting had taught the community that resilience required not only individual strength, but also collective wisdom. They had learned to share burdens, pool resources, and support one another through difficult times. These lessons would prove valuable regardless of when the rains returned, creating social bonds and cooperative practices that would strengthen the community for generations to come. As autumn deepened and the first hints of seasonal change became apparent in the shifting light and cooler nights, the villagers maintained their patient vigil while also preparing for whatever the coming months might bring. They had learned that waiting could be an active process, filled with meaningful work, and sustained by hope that was grounded in practical preparation and spiritual faith. They had discovered that communities could endure extended hardship when members supported one another and maintained connection to larger purposes that transcended immediate suffering. The story of their waiting was itself becoming part of the village's history, a narrative that would be passed down to future generations as an example of how communities could respond to natural disasters with wisdom, cooperation, and grace. They had learned that the rain would return in its own time, and that their task was not to control forces beyond their influence, but to respond to those forces with courage, creativity, and compassion for one another. And so the medieval farmers continued their vigil, watching the skies with patient eyes, trusting in the ancient rhythms of earth and heaven, knowing that their waiting itself was a form of faith that connected them to all who had waited before, and all who would wait again in the endless cycle of seasons that governs all life beneath the vast and ever-changing sky. As this chapter closes, its eyes, another tale begins to stir in the gentle embrace of night, where new stories of patient souls await our listening hearts. In the quiet valleys where time moves like honey, where ancient paths wind through meadows kissed by moonlight, the shepherds of old kept their gentle vigil. Tonight, we follow their footsteps across fields where starlight once gathered like silver coins, waiting to be counted by those who understood the language of the sky. The hills of Anatolia stretched endlessly beneath the indigo canopy of night, their gentle slopes painted silver by the moon's tender brush. Here, where civilizations had risen and fallen like the breathing of the earth itself, Mehmet the shepherd walked the same paths his grandfather's grandfather had worn smooth with centuries of quiet footsteps. The year was 1247, and the world moved at the pace of seasons, measured not in hours, but in the turning of stars across the vast dome of heaven. His sandaled feet knew every stone, every dip and rise of the ancient track that wound between the olive groves and up toward the high pastures where his flock waited. The sheep, white as scattered clouds against the dark grass, dozed peacefully in their natural circle, trusting in his presence as their ancestors had trusted in the shepherds who came before. The air carried the sweet scent of wild thyme and lavender, herbs that grew wild in these hills and released their perfume into the cooling night. Mehmet settled himself against the weathered trunk of an ancient oak tree, its bark smooth and warm still from the day's sun. This tree had been his grandfather's watching post, and his grandfather's before him. The deep grooves worn in its bark told stories of countless nights like this one, when shepherds had leaned against its sturdy frame and gazed upward at the eternal dance of celestial lights. Above him, the stars began their nightly emergence, appearing first as faint pinpricks of light, then growing brighter as the sky deepened from purple to black. He knew their names in the old tongue, the words his grandfather had whispered to him during nights like this, when he was just a boy learning the ancient ways. There was Aldebaran, the follower, chasing the seven sisters across the sky. There was Vega, the falling eagle, bright and steady in the northern heights. Each star held its place in the grand story that unfolded night after night, season after season, year after year. The shepherd reached into his leather pouch and withdrew a small wooden flute, carved by his own hands from a branch of the very tree that sheltered him now. The instrument was simple, bearing no decoration save for the natural grain of the wood and the gentle wear of his fingers upon its surface. He raised it to his lips and breathed out a soft, melodious note that drifted across the hillside like a whispered prayer. The melody that emerged was older than memory, a tune that shepherds had played for their flocks since the first man learned to gentle the wild sheep of these hills. It spoke of patience and protection, of long nights spent in faithful watching, of the deep bond between shepherd and flock that transcended words. The notes floated on the still air, reaching the ears of his sheep, who stirred gently but did not wake, comforted by the familiar sound of their guardian's song. As he played, Mehmet's eyes traced the familiar constellations, reading them like pages in a well-loved book. The Great Bear turned slowly around the northern star, marking the passage of the night hours. The swan spread its wings across the river of light that flowed from horizon to horizon, that celestial stream the ancients called the Path of Souls. Each constellation held its story, passed down through generations of shepherds who had kept watch beneath these same stars. His grandfather had told him of the time when the stars danced more brightly, when the old gods still walked among the olive groves and shepherds might glimpse strange lights moving among the hills. Those days were fading now, replaced by new faiths and new ways of understanding the world. But here, in the quiet spaces between day and night, the old magic still lingered like morning mist in the valleys. A gentle breeze stirred the grass around him, carrying with it the distant sound of water trickling over stones in the valley below. The stream that wound through these hills had never run dry in all the years of his family's watching. It rose from springs deep in the earth, springs that his grandfather said were blessed by the spirits of the mountains. The sound of that eternal flow had lullabied countless generations of shepherds to sleep, a constant reminder of the continuity that flowed beneath all change. Mehmet lowered his flute and reached for the small clay cup that hung from his belt. He filled it from a skin of water that stayed cool even in the heat of summer, water drawn from the blessed spring at dawn. The liquid was clear and sweet, carrying the taste of mineral-rich stone and the memory of underground rivers. As he drank, he felt the connection to the land that had sustained his people for centuries, the deep roots that bound him to this place and this calling. Around him, the night sounds began their ancient symphony. Crickets chirped their rhythmic chorus from the grass, their voices rising and falling in waves of sound that seemed to breathe with the earth itself. An owl called from the olive grove below, its voice carrying across the hillside like a benediction. Somewhere in the distance, a nightingale began to sing, its liquid notes weaving through the starlight like silver thread through dark cloth. The shepherd closed his eyes and listened to this nightly concert, each sound as familiar to him as his own heartbeat. In the rustle of leaves, he heard the whispers of his ancestors, their voices carried on the wind that had blown across these hills since time began. In the distant howl of a wolf, he heard the wildness that still lived in the hidden places, the untamed spirit that kept the world balanced between civilization and nature. When he opened his eyes again, the Milky Way had grown bright and clear. Above him, that river of light that flowed from one horizon to the other, His grandfather had called it the Shepherd's Road, the path that souls followed when they left this world for the next. Tonight it seemed especially luminous, as if lit from within by some celestial fire that made each star burn with particular brilliance. Mehmet stood and walked among his flock, counting them not with numbers, but with the deep knowing that came from years of tending. Each sheep was known to him, from the old ewe with the crooked horn to the young ram who still thought himself brave enough to challenge the shepherd's authority. They slept peacefully, trusting in his vigilance, their white forms scattered across the hillside like fallen stars. As he moved among them, the shepherd thought of the rhythm that governed this life, the ancient pattern of seasons and cycles that had shaped his people's existence for countless generations. In spring, there was the joy of new lambs, their unsteady legs and questioning bleats bringing laughter to the serious business of tending. Summer brought long days in the high pastures, where the grass grew sweet and the air was thin and clean. Autumn was the time of gathering, when the flock moved down from the heights to the safer valleys, and winter brought the quiet months of shelter and waiting. Each season had its stars, its own configuration of lights that marked the turning of the year. The shepherd knew them all, could read in their positions the proper time for shearing, for breeding, for moving the flock to new pastures. This knowledge was not written in books, but lived in the memory, passed from father to son in the quiet hours of the night watch, when the ancient wisdom could be shared without the distractions of the day. A shooting star streaked across the sky, its brief fire drawing a line of light from the bear to the swan. Mehmet smiled and made the old blessing, the words his grandfather had taught him for such moments when the heavens reminded mortals of their presence. The star's light faded quickly, but its passage seemed to leave the night somehow brighter, as if its brief brilliance had awakened something in the darkness. The shepherd returned to his place beneath the oak and settled back against its familiar trunk. The night was deep now, the darkest hours before dawn, when the world seemed to hold its breath in anticipation of the returning light. These were the hours he treasured most, when time moved slowly and the boundary between earth and sky grew thin. In this quietude, he could feel the presence of all who had sat in this same spot, keeping the same watch under the same eternal stars. He thought of his son, sleeping now in the village below, who would one day take up this ancient calling. The boy was eager to learn, already showing the patience and gentleness that marked a true shepherd. Soon, he would bring the child to these hills for his first night watch, to begin the slow process of learning the stars and their stories, the songs and their meanings, the deep rhythms that governed this timeless life. The oak tree creaked softly in the breeze, its voice like the sighing of old wood that had weathered countless storms and seasons. In that sound, Mehmet heard the patience of growing things, the wisdom that came from deep roots, and the long view that only trees could take. The oak had been young when his great-grandfather first brought his flocks to these hills. It would be ancient when his great-grandson's children carried on the watching. In its slow growth, he saw the continuity that connected all things, the unbroken chain that linked past to future through the eternal present of each peaceful night. A moth fluttered past his face, drawn by some invisible light that existed beyond the range of human senses. Its wings caught the starlight for a moment, creating a brief flash of silver before it disappeared into the darkness. The shepherd watched its erratic flight and thought of all the small lives that moved through the night, the countless creatures that shared these hills and made them home. Each had its place in the great pattern, its role in the endless dance of life and death and renewal that played out beneath the watching stars. The night air grew cooler as the hours passed, carrying with it the promise of morning dew and the fresh scents that would rise with the sun. Mehmet pulled his woolen cloak closer around his shoulders, the garment woven by his wife from the fleece of his own sheep. The wool held the warmth of his body and the memory of the animals who had given it, another link in the chain that bound him to his calling and his place. As the eastern sky began to show the faintest hint of grey, the first birds began to stir in the olive trees below. Their tentative chirps would soon become the dawn chorus that greeted each new day. But for now, they were just gentle reminders that the night's watch was drawing to its close. The shepherd stood and stretched, his joints stiff from the long hours of sitting, but his spirit refreshed by the communion with sky and star and the peaceful breathing of his sleeping flock. He walked once more among the sheep, checking each one with the careful eye of long experience. All was well, as he had known it would be. The ancient compact between shepherd and flock remained unbroken. The trust that allowed these gentle creatures to rest secure in the knowledge that their guardian kept watch through the dark hours. Soon the sun would rise and the day's business would begin. But for now, there was only the quiet satisfaction of duty fulfilled and the deep peace that came from being exactly where he belonged. The stars began to fade as the sky lightened, their fires dimming before the approaching glory of the sun. But Mehmet knew they were not truly gone, only waiting for the turning of the earth to bring them back into view. Like the rhythm of seasons and the pattern of years, the stars would return, faithful and eternal, to light the way for other shepherds. In other times, keeping their ancient vigil beneath the vast and gentle dome of night. As the first golden rays touched the hilltops and his flock began to stir, the shepherd offered one last prayer of gratitude to the night that was ending and the day that was beginning. In this moment of transition, he felt the full weight and wonder of his calling. The privilege of standing guard over these peaceful creatures in this peaceful place, connected by bonds older than memory to the earth and sky and all the quiet lives that moved between them. The hush of hillside fades into morning light, and somewhere beyond these ancient paths, another gentle tale waits to unfold. In the hushed corridors, where ancient stones held centuries of whispered prayers, where candlelight danced against weathered walls, and where the gentle rhythm of bells marked each sacred hour, there dwelt a peace so profound that time itself seemed to slow its restless march. Brother Thomas had known the rhythm of the bells for 37 years, each chime a familiar friend that guided his days like a gentle shepherd leading sheep through verdant pastures. The monastery of St. Benedict nestled in a valley where morning mist clung to rolling hills, and where the ancient oak trees stood as silent witnesses to generations of devoted souls who had walked these same stone paths in quiet contemplation. The first bell of each day rang at Lord's, when the darkness still held dominion over the world, and the stars remained scattered like pearls across the velvet sky. Brother Thomas would wake not to the jarring call of the bronze voice echoing through the corridors, but to something deeper, something that stirred in his bones before sound ever reached his ears. It was as though his soul had learned to dance with the rhythm of the divine hours, anticipating each sacred moment before it arrived. In the gentle pre-dawn darkness, he would rise from his narrow bed, the wool blanket falling away like a quiet benediction. The stone floor beneath his bare feet carried the coolness of centuries. Each step a small prayer offered to the God who dwelt in the silence between heartbeats. The corridor stretched before him, lit by oil lamps that cast dancing shadows on walls worn smooth by countless hands trailing along them in reverent procession. The chapel awaited in hushed expectation, its vaulted ceiling disappearing into shadows that seemed to hold the prayers of all who had come before. Brother Thomas took his place in the choir stall, the carved wood worn smooth by decades of faithful occupancy. Around him, his brothers gathered like flowers opening to the first light of dawn, each man carrying within his heart the same deep well of peace that had drawn them all to this life of quiet devotion. As the first psalms began to flow like honey from their lips, Brother Thomas felt the familiar settling that came with morning prayer. The Latin words, ancient and beautiful, created a river of sound that seemed to flow not just from their mouths, but from their very souls. Each syllable was a stone placed carefully in the stream of eternity, creating ripples that would spread far beyond the walls of their small sanctuary. When Lord's concluded and the brothers dispersed to their morning labours, Brother Thomas made his way to the scriptorium, where vellum pages awaited his careful hand. The art of illumination had become his particular calling, each letter a small masterpiece of devotion and patience. He would spend the morning hours bent over his work, his quill moving with the practiced grace of one who understood that beauty created in service of the divine was itself a form of prayer. The morning light filtered through tall windows, casting geometric patterns across his work surface. Brother Thomas would pause occasionally to dip his quill in ink that he had mixed himself from oak gall and iron, the deep black flowing like liquid night across the pale vellum. Each letter he formed was a meditation, each word a small offering, placed upon the altar of eternity. The gold leaf he applied with delicate brushstrokes caught the light and threw it back in tiny explosions of brilliance, as though the very words themselves were touched with divine fire. Around him, the other scribes worked in companionable silence. The only sounds the gentle scratching of quills across parchment and the soft rustle of pages being turned. Brother Martin, who specialized in copying sacred texts, would occasionally pause to stretch his fingers, his arthritis a constant reminder of the decades he had spent in service to the written word. Brother James, youngest among them, worked with the intense concentration of one still learning his craft, his tongue pressed slightly between his lips as he carefully formed each character. When the bell rang for terce at the 3rd hour, the brothers would set down their tools and make their way once again to the chapel. This mid-morning prayer carried a different quality than Lord's, warmed by the growing light of day and infused with the productive energy of morning labor. Brother Thomas loved how each prayer time had its own particular flavor, its own unique way of settling into his heart and mind. After terce, the morning continued with work that varied by season and need. In spring, Brother Thomas might find himself in the monastery garden, working alongside Brother Augustine to tend the herbs that would season their simple meals and provide healing balms for the infirmary. The earth beneath his knees felt alive with possibility, and he would spend peaceful hours transplanting seedlings and weeding among the neat rows of basil, thyme, and sage. The garden existed in a courtyard surrounded by covered walkways, where Brother Thomas could work in gentle shade while still feeling the warmth of the sun on his back. Ancient fruit trees grew against the southern wall, their branches heavy with blossoms in spring and fruit in autumn. A small fountain bubbled softly at the center of the space, its water flowing from a carved stone basin to nourish the plants and provide a gentle accompaniment to the rhythm of their work. Brother Augustine had tended this garden for more than 40 years, and his hands seemed to know instinctively what each plant needed. He would move among the rows like a shepherd among his flock, pausing to pinch dead blooms from the healing calendula, or to tie up bean vines that had grown too tall for their stakes. His knowledge flowed like a gentle stream to the younger brothers who worked alongside him, shared not through lengthy explanations, but through quiet demonstration and patient guidance. As the morning progressed toward midday, the brothers would gradually make their way to preparation for sext, the prayer that marked the 6th hour and the heart of the day. The chapel would fill once again with their quiet presence, each man carrying within himself the fruits of his morning labor, whether it be beautifully copied scriptures, tended plants, or bread baked in the monastery kitchen. Brother Paul, who oversaw the bakery, would arrive at sext with flour still dusting his brown habit and the sweet scent of fresh bread clinging to his clothes. He had risen even earlier than the others to begin the day's baking, kneading dough in the pre-dawn. Darkness while his brothers slept. The rhythm of his work provided its own form of prayer. Each fold and turn of the dough a meditation on the mystery of transformation that lay at the heart of their faith. The bread Brother Paul created fed not only the community, but also the poor who came to their gates seeking sustenance. Each loaf was shaped with care and baked to perfection, the crust golden and crisp, the interior soft and warm. Brother Thomas had often reflected on how Brother Paul's work embodied the same principles that guided his own illumination. Each creation a small masterpiece offered in service to something greater than oneself. Following sext and the midday meal taken in contemplative silence, the afternoon hours stretched ahead with their own particular rhythm. Brother Thomas would often return to the scriptorium, but the quality of the afternoon light called for different work. This was the time for studying the texts he illuminated, for deepening his understanding of the sacred words he made beautiful with his art. The monastery library held treasures accumulated over centuries, volumes copied by generations of scribes who had walked these same corridors and felt the same calling to preserve and share sacred knowledge. Brother Thomas would select a text and settle into one of the wooden reading chairs placed near the tall windows, the afternoon sun warming the pages as he read. The silence of the library was different from the silence of prayer or work. It was a deep, contemplative quiet that seemed to pulse with the accumulated wisdom of all the words contained within those walls. Brother Thomas could spend hours lost in the writings of the Church Fathers, their insights into the divine mystery unfolding. Like flowers in his mind, each paragraph offered new depths to explore, new connections to discover between the words he copied and the faith they expressed. Brother Cyril, the monastery librarian, moved like a gentle ghost among the shelves, his knowledge of every volume encyclopedic and his care for each book tender as a mother's love for her children. He had trained several generations of young brothers in the proper handling of manuscripts, teaching them to turn pages with reverence and to approach each text as a sacred encounter with the divine word. As the afternoon progressed toward evening, the quality of light in the library would shift from the bright clarity of midday to the golden warmth that spoke of day's end approaching. Brother Thomas would sometimes pause in his reading to watch dust motes dancing in the slanted rays that fell across his table, each tiny speck moving in its own mysterious pattern, as though even the smallest particles of creation were engaged in some cosmic dance of praise. The bell for none would eventually call him away from his studies, its bronze voice echoing through the library with gentle insistence. The 9th hour prayer carried within it the weight of afternoon accomplishment and the anticipation of evening's approach. Brother Thomas would carefully close whatever volume he had been reading, marking his place with a thin strip of vellum, and make his way once again to the chapel. None had always felt to Brother Thomas like the prayer of gratitude, a moment to acknowledge the gifts of the day and to prepare the heart for the transition toward evening and rest. The afternoon light filtering through the chapel windows created patterns of colored light that shifted slowly across the stone floor as the sun continued its ancient journey across the sky. After none, the brothers would often gather in the chapter, house for communal reading and reflection. One brother would read aloud from a spiritual text, while the others listened in attentive silence, their hands busy with simple tasks that required little concentration. Brother Thomas might work on preparing quills for the next day's writing, carefully cutting and shaping each one to create the perfect writing instrument. The chapter house was a circular room with stone benches built into the walls, creating an intimate space where the community could gather as one body. The acoustics of the room carried the reader's voice clearly to every corner, and Brother Thomas had often marveled at how different texts seemed to take on new meaning when heard in this particular space, surrounded by his brothers in faith. Brother David, whose voice had been chosen for its particular clarity and warmth, would read with the careful pacing of one who understood that each word deserved to be savored. Whether the text was from the Rule of Saint Benedict, the writings of the Desert Fathers, or the theological insights of Augustine, Brother David's reading transformed the words from marks on a page into living truth that settled into the hearts of his listeners. As evening approached and the light began to fade from gold to amber to deep rose, the brothers would prepare for Vespers, the evening prayer that marked the transition from day to night. This was perhaps Brother Thomas's favorite hour of prayer, carrying within it both the satisfaction of a day well lived and the peaceful anticipation of night's rest. The chapel at Vespers was transformed by candlelight, the dancing flames creating an atmosphere of intimate warmth that drew the brothers together in a particularly close bond of fellowship. The evening psalms seemed to flow with special beauty in this golden light, each voice blending with the others to create a harmony that felt like a foretaste of heavenly worship. Brother Thomas would often find himself moved to tears during Vespers, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming sense of rightness that came with this life of ordered prayer and simple devotion. The bells that had called him to each prayer throughout the day had woven together a tapestry of worship that felt both timeless and immediate, both deeply personal and profoundly communal. Following Vespers and the evening meal, the brothers would have a brief period of recreation before the final prayer of the day. This was the time for quiet conversation, for sharing observations about their work or insights from their reading. Brother Thomas particularly enjoyed these moments of gentle fellowship, when the formal structure of the day relaxed slightly to allow for the simple pleasure of friendship. Brother Francis, who tended the monastery beehives, would often share stories of his observations of the industrious insects whose honey sweetened their bread and whose wax provided candles for their prayers. His eyes would light up as he described the intricate organization of the hive, the way each bee seemed to know its role in the larger community, just as each brother knew his place in their own spiritual family. Brother Marcus, who had joined the community only recently after a successful career as a merchant, would sometimes share insights from his former life that helped the brothers understand the world beyond their walls. His perspective, still fresh with memory of secular concerns, provided a valuable balance to the contemplative wisdom of those who had spent decades in monastic life. As the final hour of the day approached, the brothers would gather one last time for compline, the prayer that completed the cycle of worship and prepared them for the restorative silence of night. The chapel at Compline felt like a sanctuary within a sanctuary. The darkness outside the windows pressing against the warm circle of candlelight within. The prayers of Compline were gentle and brief, filled with psalms of trust and protection that settled into the heart like a benediction. Brother Thomas would recite the familiar words while feeling the deep contentment that came with another day lived in faithful response to the divine calling. Each day in the monastery was both exactly like those that had come before and completely unique, as though the eternal rhythm of prayer created infinite variations on a theme of perfect beauty. After Compline, the great silence would begin, lasting until the first bell of the following day. Brother Thomas would make his way through corridors lit only by the occasional oil lamp, his feet moving along paths worn smooth by countless others who had walked this same route to rest. The silence was not empty but full, pregnant with the peace that comes from a day spent in conscious attention to the sacred. In his small cell, Brother Thomas would perform his final preparations for sleep with the same careful attention he brought to all his activities. He would fold his habit neatly, place his sandals precisely by his bed, and settle onto his simple mattress stuffed with straw. The window of his cell looked out onto the garden where he had worked that morning, now silver with moonlight and filled with the gentle sounds of night. As he lay in the darkness, Brother Thomas would review the gifts of the day just concluded, the morning's illumination work, where he had added delicate scroll work to a capital letter depicting St. Francis preaching to birds. The afternoon's reading, where a passage from Gregory the Great had opened new understanding about the nature of contemplative prayer. The evening's conversation with Brother Augustine about the proper time for harvesting the medicinal herbs that would be dried for winter use. Each memory was like a small treasure to be examined and appreciated before, being offered back to the God who had made such richness possible. Brother Thomas had learned over his years in the monastery that gratitude was perhaps the most essential spiritual discipline, the foundation upon which all other virtues were built. Each bell that had rung throughout the day had been not just a call to prayer, but an invitation to deeper thankfulness. The monastery itself seemed to settle into peaceful rest around him, the ancient stones radiating back the warmth they had absorbed from the day's sun. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called softly, and Brother Thomas smiled in the darkness, recognizing in that sound another voice raised in the great symphony of creation's praise. He thought of his brothers sleeping in their own cells, each man carrying within his heart the same deep peace that filled his own. Brother Paul would be dreaming perhaps of tomorrow's bread already mentally preparing the dough that would rise in the cool of night to be ready for early morning baking. Brother Augustine might be planning the garden work that would fill his morning hours, deciding which beds needed weeding and which herbs were ready for harvesting. The rhythm of bells that had shaped this day would repeat tomorrow and all the tomorrows that followed, creating an endless cycle of prayer and work that connected their small community to the larger rhythm of eternity. Brother Thomas had often reflected on the beautiful paradox of monastic life, how by embracing limitation and routine, they discovered infinite freedom and variety. Each day brought its own small miracles and quiet revelations. A particularly beautiful morning light streaming through the scriptorium windows. A moment of perfect harmony during the singing of a familiar psalm. The discovery of a new insight in a text he had read dozens of times before. The satisfaction of completing a particularly challenging piece of illumination work. As sleep began to claim him, Brother Thomas offered one final prayer of gratitude for the gift of this calling, for the brothers who shared this journey, and for the bells that would continue to mark the sacred hours long after he had gone to his eternal rest. The monastery would endure, the prayers would continue, and new generations of seekers would find their way to this place of peace. In the gathering darkness, surrounded by the profound silence that followed Compline, Brother Thomas felt himself held in the embrace of a love larger than his understanding. The bells had marked not just the hours of the day, but the heartbeat of eternity itself. Each chime a reminder that time was sacred, and each moment a gift to be received with wonder and offered back with praise. The last conscious thought that drifted through his mind was gratitude for tomorrow's first bell, which would call him once again to begin the ancient dance of prayer and work, of silence and song that had shaped his days for 37 years and would, God willing, continue to shape them for whatever years remained. In this rhythm of bells and prayers, he had found not just a way of life, but life itself, abundant and eternal. Let us now drift gently into the next forgotten story, where other souls discovered their own sacred rhythms in the quiet corners of history. In the deepest hush before morning's first breath, when darkness still cradles the world in velvet arms, there lived those who shaped light itself. Their gentle hands worked in sacred silence, crafting illumination from humble wax and patient flame, weaving dawn's promise into tender, glowing forms that would guide the world through shadow. The hour was neither night nor morning, but that precious threshold between worlds, when Brother Thomas pushed open the heavy wooden door of the candle-making workshop. The hinges whispered their familiar greeting, a soft creak that had welcomed him each dawn for 27 years. His feet, wrapped in worn leather shoes that had molded perfectly to his steady gait, found their way across the stone floor without need for sight. Every cobble, every slight dip and rise in the ancient stones spoke to him of home and purpose. The workshop breathed around him, filled with the lingering sweetness of beeswax and the deeper, earthier scent of tallow that had been rendered the evening before. These were the perfumes of his calling, as familiar and comforting as the rhythm of his own heartbeat. Thomas moved through the darkness with the grace of long practice, his fingers trailing along the wooden workbench until they found the small clay lamp that waited in its appointed place. The flint and steel lay beside it, cool and patient in his palm. The first spark bloomed like a tiny star against the darkness, followed by another, and then the blessed catch of flame against the oil-soaked wick. Light spread in a gentle circle, pushing back the shadows with tender insistence. The golden glow revealed the workshop's familiar geography. Rows of wooden dipping frames, great copper pots for melting wax, coils of fresh cotton wick hanging from pegs like sleeping serpents, and shelves lined with candles in various stages of completion. Thomas set the lamp upon its iron stand and turned toward the hearth, where embers from the previous evening's fire glowed like tiny ruby hearts beneath a blanket of ash. He knelt before them with reverence, adding kindling with the careful attention of one who understood that fire was both servant and master. The first flames licked upward, tentative and pale, growing stronger as they found purchase in the dry wood. Soon, the hearth bloomed with warm light that danced across the stone walls, painting shifting shadows that seemed to pulse with life. The copper pot waited beside the hearth, already filled with chunks of pure beeswax that Brother Jerome had prepared during the afternoon hours. Thomas lifted it with both hands, feeling the substantial weight of tomorrow's light contained within cold, pale blocks. The wax would soon transform from solid matter into liquid gold, ready to embrace the waiting wicks and form itself into pillars of illumination. As the pot settled over the flames, Thomas began the ancient ritual of preparation. His hands moved with practiced economy, each gesture the product of countless repetitions that had worn smooth grooves in his memory. He selected cotton wicks from the hanging coils, testing each one between thumb and forefinger for proper thickness and strength. Too thin, and the flame would struggle and smoke. Too thick, and the candle would burn too quickly, wasting precious material. Each wick must be perfect, chosen with the care of a master craftsman who understood that light itself depended upon such small perfections. The first signs of melting appeared as pale moisture at the edges of the wax blocks. Thomas stirred gently with a wooden paddle, its surface polished smooth by years of use. The motion was meditative, circular and steady, like the turning of prayer wheels or the slow revolution of seasons. In the growing warmth of the workshop, he could feel his muscles relaxing into the familiar rhythm of his craft. Beyond the workshop walls, the monastery continued its own ancient rhythms. Thomas could hear the soft footsteps of Brother Marcus making his way to the chapel for matins, the whispered prayers that would soon fill the sacred space with gentle devotion. The bell tower stood silent now, but Thomas knew that in an hour's time, its bronze voice would call the faithful to prayer. His candles would light their way, small flames carrying human hope through the darkness. The wax had begun to surrender to the heat, edges melting into pools of liquid gold that caught and reflected the firelight. Thomas added more wood to the flames, careful to maintain the perfect temperature that would melt without burning, transform without destroying. The sweet scent of warming beeswax filled the air, mingling with the wood smoke and the lingering perfume of dried herbs that Brother Augustine had hung from the workshop rafters. As the wax transformed, Thomas prepared his dipping frame, a wooden contraption that could hold dozens of wicks suspended at precise intervals. Each wick was tied to a horizontal rod, hanging straight and ready to receive its coating of molten wax. The frame was a marvel of simple engineering, crafted by Brother Peter in the monastery's woodshop according to designs passed down through generations of candle makers. The first dip required perfect timing, too hot, and the wax would slide off the wick like water. Too cool, and it would not adhere properly, creating lumps and imperfections that would mar the candle's beauty. Thomas tested the temperature with the tip of his smallest finger, a quick touch that told him everything he needed to know. The wax was ready, warm and flowing like liquid silk. He lifted the dipping frame and lowered it slowly into the molten wax, watching as the golden liquid embraced each wick with gentle precision. The first coating was always thin, just enough to give the cotton fibers something to hold, a foundation upon which layers of light could be built. He raised the frame and held it steady, allowing excess wax to drip back into the pot while the coating cooled and hardened. This was the beginning of a dance that would continue through the morning hours, each dip adding another layer, each layer bringing the candles closer to completion. Thomas moved with the rhythm of meditation, lowering and raising, pausing and continuing, his breathing slow and deep in harmony with his work. The growing candles caught the firelight and seemed to glow with inner warmth, as if they already contained the flames they would one day support. Between dips, Thomas would add more wax to the pot, stoking the fire, adjusting the temperature with minute additions of fuel. His movements had become so automatic that his mind was free to wander into prayer and contemplation. He thought of the people who would light these candles in days to come, families gathering for evening meals, scholars bent over manuscripts, pilgrims finding their way through unfamiliar streets, lovers stealing moments of tenderness in candlelit chambers. The workshop grew warmer as the morning progressed, and Thomas could hear the gradual awakening of the monastery around him. Brother Francis passed by the workshop window, his sandals scuffing softly against the cobblestones as he made his way to tend the herb garden. The kitchen began to show signs of life as Brother Sebastian prepared the morning meal. The distant clatter of pots and the whisper of bellows fanning the cooking fires. Each dip added substance to the growing candles. What had begun as bare cotton, threads now wore coats of creamy wax, their forms growing fuller and more substantial with each pass through the golden pool. Thomas examined each candle carefully, looking for imperfections that might affect their burning. A small bubble here, a slight irregularity there, could be smoothed away with gentle pressure from his warm palms. The sun began its slow climb above the eastern hills, sending the first tentative rays through the workshop's small windows. The light fell across Thomas's work like a blessing, illuminating the rows of pale candles that hung like captured moonbeams from their wooden frame. He paused in his dipping to appreciate this moment when natural light met its crafted counterpart, when dawn acknowledged the patient work of human hands. As the candles grew thicker, Thomas adjusted his technique. The later dips required more care, as the weight of accumulated wax made the candles more susceptible to damage. He moved more slowly now, allowing more time between dips for the wax to cool and harden. Patience was the candlemaker's greatest virtue, the understanding that true craftsmanship could not be hurried. Brother Jerome appeared in the doorway, his robes rustling softly as he stepped into the workshop. He was Thomas's apprentice, though at 30 years old, he had been learning the craft for nearly a decade. His hands bore the small scars and permanent wax stains that marked him as a true candlemaker, evidence of countless hours spent in service to light itself. Together, they worked in comfortable silence, their movements coordinated by years of partnership. Jerome prepared a second dipping frame, while Thomas continued his careful work on the first batch. The workshop filled with the quiet sounds of their craft. The gentle bubbling of melting wax, the soft scrape of paddle against pot, the whispered consultation about temperature and timing. The morning bell finally rang, its bronze voice carrying, across the monastery grounds and into the surrounding countryside. Thomas smiled as he heard it, knowing that his candles from previous days now burned in the chapel, their steady flames supporting the community's prayers. It was a satisfying thought that his work had become part of the sacred rhythm that governed monastic life. As the first batch of candles neared completion, Thomas began preparing colored wax for special orders. The monastery's altar candles required the addition of precious saffron, which turned the wax a deep golden yellow reminiscent of heavenly light. He ground the dried stamens with a marble pestle, releasing their earthy perfume into the workshop. Air. The powder dissolved into the hot wax like sunset melting into evening, creating a color that seemed to hold light even when unlit. Jerome worked with plain white wax, crafting the everyday candles that would light the monks' cells and work spaces. His technique had improved markedly over the years, and Thomas felt the deep satisfaction of a teacher watching his student master a difficult art. The young man's candles were now nearly indistinguishable from Thomas's own, smooth and straight, and perfect for their intended purpose. The workshop had become a small world unto itself, filled with the gentle industry of creation. Outside, the monastery continued its ancient routines, but within these walls, time seemed suspended in the eternal moment of transformation. Raw materials became objects of beauty and utility. Darkness was held at bay by human ingenuity, and two men continued a tradition that stretched back through centuries of faithful craftsmanship. As the sun climbed higher, Thomas began the final phase of his morning's work. The completed candles needed to be trimmed, their tops and bottoms smoothed to perfect evenness. He used a sharp knife warmed in the flame, slicing through the wax with clean, decisive cuts. Each candle was then inspected one final time, rolled between his palms to ensure straightness, and set aside to continue cooling. The finishing work required different skills than the dipping process. Here, Thomas's artistic sense came into play as he shaped the candle tops into gentle points that would catch flame easily and burn cleanly. His fingers moved over each surface, detecting tiny imperfections that might escape a casual glance but would affect the candle's performance. A small tool fashioned from bone allowed him to carve decorative patterns into special candles destined for feast day celebrations. Jerome watched these finishing techniques with careful attention, understanding that this was where craft became art, where functional objects took on beauty that would enhance their usefulness. The young man's questions were few but thoughtful, demonstrating his growing understanding of the subtleties that separated adequate work from true mastery. The morning's production represented hours of patient labor, yet the candles themselves would burn for only a fraction of that time. This paradox had always fascinated Thomas, that so much care and attention should be devoted to creating something designed to consume itself in service to others. Yet this was the essence of his calling, to transform raw materials into light and warmth that would comfort and guide those who needed illumination. As the workshop began to cool with the completion of the morning's work, Thomas felt the familiar satisfaction that came with tasks well accomplished. The rows of finished candles stood like silent soldiers, ready to take their places in the ongoing battle against darkness. Each one represented not just hours of labor, but also prayers and intentions, hopes and dreams for the light they would provide. Brother Jerome carefully transferred the completed candles to wooden storage boxes, cushioning each one with soft cloth to prevent damage during transport. Some would remain within the monastery, lighting prayers and illuminating sacred texts. Others would travel to nearby villages, carrying the blessing of monastic craftsmanship into humble homes and workshops. A few special pieces, decorated with carved symbols and tinted with precious colors, would journey to distant cities where they would grace the altars of great cathedrals. The cleanup process was as ritualized as the creation itself. Tools were cleaned and returned to their designated places. Work surfaces were scraped clean of wax drippings, and the fire was banked to preserve coals for the next morning's work. Every action had its purpose and place in the cycle of creation that would begin again with tomorrow's dawn. Thomas stood for a moment in the doorway of his workshop, looking back at the space that had become so much more than mere workplace. Here, in this humble room filled with simple tools and raw materials, light itself was born each day. The morning sun now filled the space with natural illumination, but Thomas knew that when darkness returned, his candles would be ready to hold it at bay. The monastery bell chimed the hour, calling the community to the next phase of their daily rhythm. Thomas removed his leather apron and hung it on its wooden peg, where it would wait patiently for tomorrow's return to work. His hands, still warm from handling heated wax, carried the lingering scent of his craft, a perfume that had become as much a part of him as his own breath. As he stepped into the growing brightness of the day, Thomas carried with him the deep contentment that came from meaningful work well done. Behind him, the workshop settled into temporary quiet, but the fruits of the morning's labor would soon scatter into the world, tiny flames carrying forward the light that had been so carefully crafted in these pre-dawn hours. The candles would burn in places he would never see, lighting faces he would never know, supporting prayers he would never hear. Yet through his patient work, Thomas had become part of countless stories, a silent participant in moments of joy and sorrow, celebration and contemplation. This was the true reward of his calling, the knowledge that his hands had shaped not just wax and wick, but light itself, and through light, hope. In the growing warmth of the morning sun, Thomas walked slowly toward the chapel, where his candles from previous days continued their faithful service, their steady flames a testament to the ancient craft that turned simple materials into sacred light. Tomorrow would bring another dawn, another opportunity to shape illumination from darkness. Another day in the endless cycle of creation that had sustained his community for generations uncounted. The workshop door closed softly behind him, sealing in the lingering warmth and the promise of tomorrow's work, while the morning light continued its own patient journey across the stone floors, where, in just a few hours, the dance of flame and wax would begin anew. A soft thank you to you, the listener, for joining us through these gentle hours of creation and contemplation. If you're new here, we'd love to have you subscribe so you never miss a story, and may your own dreams be filled with the warm light of peaceful moments and quiet craftsmanship.